you'll hear this busy signal.
You do not remember the 1970s for the headlines. You remember the way it felt. The buzz of a television, the freedom of your bike, the smell of dinner from down the block. Growing up in the 1970s means you remember this. The little things that quietly shaped an unforgettable decade. There was a smell that defined school in the 1970s. And no, it was not just the cafeteria mystery meat. We are talking about the sweet, heady scent of freshly copied worksheets from the mimeograph machine. You know the one. Teachers would walk in with a stack of slightly damp, purplish pages, and every kid in class would lean in for a whiff. It was like some kind of strange reward for paying attention. That chemical smell clung to your fingers and your backpack, and for some reason, it made spelling quizzes feel just a little less terrifying. The magic was in the moment, a mix of curiosity, nostalgia, and maybe just a tiny bit of dizziness. Teachers would crank that machine by hand, and it felt like watching science in action. Back then, the world felt more tactile. You held things, smelled things, and sometimes even licked the glue off an envelope like it was a snack. Sure, we have tablets and smartboards now, but show someone a ditto sheet and they will time travel right back to 3rd grade. You cannot digitize something like that. But speaking of things you waited all week for, nothing beat the pure joy of Saturday morning when the screen lit up and the cartoons took over. Saturday mornings in the 1970s were sacred. You did not sleep in. You woke up early, grabbed the biggest bowl you could find, filled it with sugary cereal, and plopped down in front of the television. This was not just a casual routine. It was a ritual. You only had a few golden hours before the grown-up programs kicked in, and every second counted. The lineup? Legendary. Looney Tunes, Scooby-Doo, the Super Friends, the Jetsons. But nestled between the slapstick and sound effects were something sneakier: public service announcements. You would be watching Bugs Bunny one minute, and the next, a little cartoon light bulb wearing sneakers would hop on screen singing, "I'm just a Bill." Suddenly, you were learning about how laws were made and the importance of brushing your teeth, all while still chewing on marshmallow shapes. And somehow, it worked. Time for Timer told you about cheese and crackers. Schoolhouse Rock gave you grammar. These messages were as much a part of your childhood as the shows themselves. They blended right into the backdrop of your Saturday, like static in between the channels. You did not always understand them, but you remembered them. And as soon as you heard the first jingle in the distance, the real fun began. Because there was something coming that could get every kid off the couch in seconds. There was no sound more powerful in the 1970s than the delicate, distant jingle of the ice cream truck. Except, it was not a jingle the way we hear it today through tinny speakers and digital loops. No, back then, the ice cream man had real brass bells. He would slowly drive down the block, gently ringing them by hand or with a string attached to the window. The sound was soft but unmistakable. It sliced through summer air like a siren of salvation. Kids would freeze mid-game, mid-bite, or a mid-sentence and yell, "Ice cream!" before bolting toward the noise barefoot, clutching whatever spare change they could dig up from a kitchen drawer or the couch cushions. The menu on the side of the truck was like a stained glass window of dreams. Push pops, rocket bombs, orange creamsicles. And if you were lucky enough to have a full $1, you might even walk away with a cartoon character bar with gumdrop eyes that always looked just a little off. The magic was not just the treat. It was the chase, the chaos, the moment. You did not schedule a visit to the ice cream truck. You hunted it. But if you wanted to feel truly rich as a kid, it did not involve frozen sweets. It happened in the aisles of the grocery store, with something you could not eat, but you definitely collected. If your mom ever handed you a little green booklet and a stack of stamps at the grocery store, you already know where this is going. S&H green stamps were basically kid currency in the 1970s. Every purchase at participating stores earned you these tiny rectangular stamps. You would go home, sit at the kitchen table, and carefully lick and stick them into pages of a booklet like some kind of mini stockbroker. And the best part? You could buy things with them. Not just little trinkets either. We are talking about radios, toasters, blenders, even bikes if you had enough patience and pages. It was like unlocking treasure chests using grocery points. And moms? They took this seriously. There were strategies. They knew which stores gave out the best deals, and they would make the rounds like pros. For kids, it felt like a weird game of Monopoly, but real. Every filled booklet was a step closer to some magical reward catalog where you could flip through and dream big. You did not just shop, you invested. And if your family loved collecting things from everyday errands, you better believe gas stations were next in line to turn a pit stop into a treasure hunt. Going to the gas station used to be fun. I am not even kidding. In the 1970s, pulling into a station was not just about filling up the tank, it was about what you got for free. Gas station giveaways were the absolute jackpot of roadside errands. You would get real glassware, like full-on drinking glasses with cartoon characters or sports team logos printed on them. There were dishes, figurines, tiny toys, even aluminum tumblers in wild colors. Some stations had full sets you could collect over time, which meant every gas stop felt like you were unlocking a new piece in the puzzle. Parents would even choose where to fill up based on who had the best freebies that week. And kids? We kept track. We knew which stations had the cool tumblers and which ones were slacking. Sometimes they even gave out trading stamps to go along with your haul, so it was a 2-for-1 deal. You might not remember the cost of gas back then, but you definitely remember that little thrill when the attendant handed over your freebie through the car window. It was like a tiny prize for just living life. But if you think that was exciting, wait until you hear about the one thing that made kids count down the days from summer to winter, flipping through pages and circling dreams. If there was ever a book that made kids believe in magic, it was the Sears Christmas Wish book. Thick, glossy, and practically glowing with possibility, it dropped into your mailbox like a brick of joy every fall. You did not read it, you devoured it. The toy section alone could occupy an afternoon. You would flip through each page slowly, pen in hand, circling dreams like you were planning a heist. Bikes, action figures, dolls with blinking eyes, remote control cars the size of shoeboxes. It was all in there. You would fold corners, make notes, maybe even leave it open to the exact page your heart was set on and hope your parents noticed. This was not just a catalog. It was a seasonal ritual. The pages felt endless. Even if you never got the big-ticket items, it did not matter. Half the fun was imagining what you could get. And if you had siblings, you better believe there were rules about who got to look at it first. Some houses had it down to a science. A few minutes each, no hogging. But all that joy had a flip side. Because nothing could snap you out of toy-filled daydreams quite like a certain buzzing sound from the television, the kind that made your heart drop even if you did not know why. That high-pitched tone, you remember it. You might even feel it in your chest right now. The emergency broadcast system test did not care what you were doing. It took over everything. You could be watching your favorite cartoon, a family sitcom, or a game show with flashing lights, and suddenly the screen would freeze, a gray static box would appear, and that bone-chilling noise would wail through the speakers. Then came the voice. Always monotone. Always distant. This is a test. This is only a test. Even though they told you it was just a drill, it still felt like the end of the world was knocking. You sat still, stared at the screen, and waited for it to go away. Some kids covered their ears. Others ran to find a parent. It was spooky in a way you could not explain. You did not know what nuclear war was, not really, but you knew this test meant something big, something adult, something terrifying. After a minute or two, it would vanish, and the show would come back on like nothing happened. But you felt different. That noise lived in your bones. Still, once the fear passed, you went back to being a kid. And in the 1970s, being a kid meant making your own fun, sometimes by putting on a show right in your backyard. The greatest performers of the 1970s did not always have their names on marquees. Sometimes they were just the neighborhood kids putting on a backyard circus or a homemade talent show. And it was epic. Someone would make a hand-drawn poster using crayons and tape it to every mailbox on the street. Another kid would bring out a wobbly card table and pretend to sell tickets. You had gymnasts flipping through hula hoops, magicians fumbling through card tricks, and singers belting out radio hits into a hairbrush. If you had a dog that could sit, that dog was now part of the act. And your little brother? He was definitely going to be the assistant, whether he liked it or not. These shows were never perfect. Costumes fell apart, music cut out, and someone always cried halfway through. But it did not matter. The parents sat on folding chairs or blankets in the grass and clapped like they were at Radio City Music Hall. It was community. It was chaos. It was childhood. And when the show was over, the kids would bow, proud and breathless. But the moment you stepped back inside the house, another kind of performance was underway, trying to sneak in a private phone call when the entire household was listening in. Phones in the 1970s were not private, not even close. They had cords, long spiral ones that stretched down hallways, wrapped around doors, and somehow always ended up tangled. Every house had one line, maybe two if you were fancy. That meant when the phone rang, it was anyone's guess who would answer and who would listen. If you were a kid trying to call a friend, you had to pass through a gauntlet of parents and siblings just to get 5 minutes of conversation. And if you were a teenager, good luck. Eavesdropping was practically a sport. Someone would quietly pick up another receiver and breathe like a horror movie villain. You would hear that subtle click and knew you were not alone. "Get off the phone" became a daily soundtrack, and heaven help you if someone else needed the line. "I'm expecting a call" meant you had to wrap it up, no matter what life-changing gossip you were in the middle of. There was no voicemail, no caller ID. If you missed a call, it was just gone. But if you wanted real independence as a kid, you had to earn it. And for many, that meant waking up while it was still dark, grabbing a heavy canvas bag and heading out into the cold. Paper routes were the ultimate crash course in growing up. It was not just a side gig. It was a rite of passage. You would get up before the sun, sometimes before your parents were even awake, pull on your jacket, and head out with that thick canvas shoulder bag that nearly dragged on the ground. The newspapers were heavy, especially on Sundays. You would roll and rubber band them the night before or as you went, if you were brave. There was a rhythm to it. Walking house to house, tossing them just right so they landed near the door but not in the bushes. You knew which neighbors tipped, which ones complained, and which ones pretended they were not home when it came time to collect. And that was the part no one warned you about, the collection. You had to knock on doors, smile politely, and ask for your money. It was awkward. It was humbling. But it made you feel grown. You earned something. And if you saved up enough, you could finally buy that thing you had been eyeing for months. A new bike, a radio, or maybe a toy. But not just any toy. We are talking about the weirdest, creepiest, most unforgettable toy of the era. One with disguises, glue-on features, and a face you could never forget. Let's talk about Hugo, man of 1,000 faces. You knew a toy was unforgettable when it lingered in your dreams, or maybe your nightmares. Hugo, man of 1,000 faces, was that toy. It was not soft or cuddly. It was a bald, plastic, mannequin-style head with eyes that seemed a little too real. And you could change its face. No, really. You got this kit full of rubbery noses, scars, mustaches, eyebrows, eye patches, and even glasses to transform Hugo into anything from a movie villain to a Cold War spy. You applied the features with a kind of glue stick that felt halfway between a craft tool and something out of a mad scientist's lab. This was not a toy you brought to bed with you. It was one you studied, experimented with, maybe even tried to prank your sibling with. There was something fascinating and just a bit unsettling about it. And yet, you kept going back to it. You made stories around those disguises, invented entire secret agent missions with Hugo at the center. Back in the 1970s, your imagination did most of the heavy lifting. That was the magic. And if you really wanted to get creative, especially in October, you did not go to the store for a costume. You went to the kitchen junk drawer, the recycling bin, and maybe the attic. Halloween in the 1970s was not a trip to a pop-up shop for a $30 superhero suit. It was a challenge, a test of creativity. A race to see who could turn a cardboard box and some tinfoil into a full-blown astronaut helmet or a robot torso. You begged your parents for old clothes, rummaged through closets for anything with a weird texture, and repurposed kitchen utensils into alien antennas. And then there were the masks. You know the ones. Thin plastic with elastic bands that snapped after 2 wears, tiny eye holes that never lined up with your face, and a mouth slit so small you could not breathe without fogging up the inside. But still, when it came time to trick or treat, you felt invincible. You became someone else. There was pride in a homemade costume. Nobody else on the block had it. You made it, with your own hands, or with your parents' help after dinner. And if your costume got torn or the rain made the paint run, you just kept going. Candy was candy, rain or shine, store-bought or not. But if you really wanted to earn something sweet, and not just from a pillowcase haul, you had to do a little hustling of your own. That meant going door to door, not for candy, but for glass bottles. Before recycling was trendy, it was profitable, at least if you were a kid in the 1970s with ambition and a wagon. You could walk up and down the block knocking on doors, asking neighbors if they had any bottles to spare. Not water bottles. We are talking glass soda and milk bottles, sturdy, heavy, and returnable. Stores gave you money for them. Not a lot, but enough. A nickel here, a dime there. If you collected enough, you could walk away with a whole $1. And in 1970s kid currency, that was like a small fortune. You could buy a comic book, a candy bar, a slushie, or save up for something even bigger. You felt responsible, independent, even a little proud. Sure, your hands smelled like old soda, and the glass sometimes had gunk in it, but that did not matter. You were earning. This was how kids learned hustle. Before allowances and debit cards, you had to get creative, and when the work was done, you went home, sat cross-legged on the shag carpet, and turned on the television to that one channel you could never quite explain. The UHF dial was like the Wild West of television. You had your regular channels, your ABC, your CBS, your NBC, but then there was the mysterious world of UHF. You had to twist the dial just right, and even then, the screen might be fuzzy, the sound might be off, but if you landed on the right frequency, you struck gold. Strange cartoons, old black and white monster movies, reruns of shows that looked like they were filmed in someone's garage, and the occasional creepy public access broadcast that made you feel like you were watching something you should not be. There were no on-screen guides, no menus. You just turned the knob and hoped for something weird and wonderful. You felt like you discovered something, like you were in on a secret. It was the 1970s version of going down a YouTube rabbit hole, only with antennas and static. And if you were lucky, you might even stumble onto a commercial for one of the most magical possessions a kid could own: a red plastic viewer with reels that could take you anywhere. The Viewmaster was not a toy, it was a portal. A red plastic device you held up to your eyes like binoculars, loaded with a circular reel of tiny photos and clicked through with your thumb. Click. A castle. Click. A dinosaur. Click. Your favorite cartoon character frozen mid-scene in bright color. It was not moving, it was not animated, but it felt alive. The 3D images popped out at you in a way that felt futuristic and dreamlike. These reels were treasures. You might get one from a souvenir shop on vacation, Niagara Falls, Disneyland, Mount Rushmore, or maybe you collected them from the toy aisle or the cereal box prize section. They were often labeled like they held top-secret intel, World Landmarks, Volume 2, or Wonders of the Sea. You never really knew what you would get until you clicked through the reel for the first time. And then you were hooked. No batteries, no sound, no screen, just light through plastic and a whole lot of imagination. But let us be honest. Sometimes the most thrilling view was not through a toy or a screen. It was through the back window of a car, facing the wrong way, waving at strangers on the highway like you were in a parade. Before seatbelts were law, or even a suggestion, the back of the station wagon was the unofficial playground of every road trip. Not the back seat, the way back, the part with no seat cushions, no legroom, and definitely no safety restraints. Just a flat surface, a few blankets, and the open view of traffic from the wrong direction. If you were lucky, you got the prime spot, right up against the tailgate window, facing backwards. That meant waving at every single driver behind you like you were in a royal motorcade. You would roll around with every turn, your snack bag sliding back and forth, trying to keep your brother from kicking you into the side panel. There was no arguing about screen time, because there were no screens. Just games, songs, or counting how many Volkswagens you passed. Parents up front, kids in the back, seatbelt laws in the future. Somehow, it all worked. You survived. You laughed. You bonded in that weird little corner of the car that smelled like crayons and seat foam. But while you were busy being reckless on the road, something even more unbelievable was happening back at school, where smoking areas were completely normal. You probably would not believe it if you did not live through it. But yes, schools in the 1970s actually had smoking areas, real ones, with ashtrays, sometimes even benches. And while most of them were meant for the teachers, there were a few high schools, especially in rural or laid-back districts, where upperclassmen were allowed to light up during lunch or between classes. That sounds wild today, but back then, it was just how things worked. You might walk to your next period and pass a group of students casually leaning against the brick wall, puffing away like it was no big deal. Teachers joined them too. Suits, skirts, chalk dust on their sleeves, and a lit cigarette in hand. Nobody batted an eye. This was before nicotine warnings hit hard, before it became taboo, before the idea of a smoke-free campus was even a thing. And it trickled down in strange ways. Because believe it or not, schools were not just cool with smoking. They encouraged you to make gifts that supported it. And nothing said Happy Father's Day like a handcrafted ashtray from art class. There was a time when bringing home an ashtray from school was the height of gift-giving excellence. You made it yourself, in art class, with clay, paint, and maybe even glitter if you felt fancy. You would pinch the edges into little shapes, carve your name into the side, and call it a day. Then it would go into the kiln, come out all shiny and lopsided, and you would proudly wrap it up for Father's Day or Christmas. For Dad, scrawled in bright orange marker. It was not weird. It was expected. Every kid made one. Every dad had at least 3 of them lined up on a side table or nightstand, usually next to a pack of matches or a half-empty can of beer. The ashtray was almost a rite of passage. It meant you were learning how to craft something useful, something an adult might actually use. Looking back, it feels bizarre, like handing a kindergartner a glue stick and saying, "Make something for Dad's smoking habit." But at the time, totally normal, completely accepted, part of growing up. And it was not even the strangest thing that came out of the school system, because if you wanted a real rush in class, you waited for one special week. The week when the books rolled in and every kid turned into a mini librarian. The Scholastic Book Fair was not just a school event, it was a moment, a highlight, a mini festival that turned your plain school library into a treasure chest of paperbacks, posters, and wildly overpriced erasers shaped like fruit. The flyers came first, folded, wrinkled sheets passed out in class with blurry covers of books like Goosebumps, The Babysitter's Club, or Encyclopedia Brown. You would take them home and circle your picks with the kind of strategy Wall Street brokers use to plan investments. You begged your parents for $2 or $3. And finally, the day came. Long tables stacked with shiny new books, spinning racks of bookmarks, and kids clutching crumpled bills like they were holding treasure maps. You browsed, you flipped. You calculated how many books you could get versus how much candy you could still afford after. Even if you only walked away with one paperback, it felt like gold. You were reading because you wanted to, not because someone told you to. That feeling stuck with you. And when the day was over and the house got quiet, you turned on the television. But back then, television did not go all night. It ended with a flag, a buzz, and the national anthem. Imagine watching late-night television, and instead of a new episode, the screen cuts to a waving American flag and a slow, solemn instrumental of the national anthem. That was not a glitch. That was the end of television for the night. In the 1970s, most channels did not run 24 hours a day. Around midnight or 1 in the morning, they signed off. A final message, a slow fade out, then static. That eerie hum that filled the screen like a ghost whisper. You knew you had stayed up too late when the anthem came on. Maybe your parents were asleep. Maybe you had snuck out of bed to watch something you were not supposed to. Either way, that sign-off was your cue. Go to bed, kid. The world is done broadcasting. And there was something peaceful about it, in a strange way. A real sense of closure. Now, with streaming and endless content, there is always something to watch. But back then, the TV told you when it was time to sleep, and you listened. But just before the day truly ended, you might have one last mission, to catch that perfect radio hit on your cassette player without the DJ ruining it with his voice. There was no thrill quite like trying to record your favorite song off the radio. You had your cassette tape loaded, finger hovering over the record and play buttons at the same time, ready to pounce. The goal? Catch the exact moment the song started, not when the DJ was still talking. Because let's be honest, DJ chatter was the enemy. You would sit by the stereo, volume low, one ear pressed against the speaker like a spy, just waiting. Sometimes you caught the song a second too late. Sometimes the DJ ruined the last note by talking over the fade-out. But when you did get it, when you hit record at just the right moment and got the full track without interruption, it felt like winning a radio lottery. You made your own mixtapes this way too, not by dragging files on a screen, but by capturing moments in real time, one perfect track at a time. You even made labels with colorful markers, giving each tape a title that meant something to you, even if it was just Cool Songs Volume 2. But not every creative moment happened with headphones and speakers. Sometimes it happened in the kitchen, next to a baking tray, with plastic sheets that curled into something magical and just a little sketchy. Shrinky dinks were the closest thing kids had to alchemy. You started with a thin sheet of plastic, blank, smooth, and full of promise. You would draw your favorite character, animal, or weird doodle with colored pencils or markers. Then came the moment of truth. You placed it in the oven, pressed your face up to the glass, and watched. Within seconds, that flimsy piece of art began to curl, warp, and shrink into a tiny, hardened charm, usually at least half the size it started as. And somehow, it stayed vibrant, tougher, glossier. It was like watching your imagination go through metamorphosis. But let's be real. There was always a little danger involved. You were told not to touch the tray. You were warned about the smell. You kind of knew something about this process probably wasn't the healthiest thing to breathe in, but nobody cared. You made keychains, fridge magnets, and badges that looked like they belonged on superhero utility belts. Every kid wanted to bring them to school. They were part craft, part magic, part minor chemistry experiment. And while we're on the subject of toys, they weren't always cheap plastic. Back then, fast food toys could hurt you, and that was half the charm. Before everything came sealed in plastic and marked ages 3 and up, fast food toys were the real deal, sometimes literally made of metal. McDonald's, Burger King, and even local diners handed out toys that were built like they were made to last through a war. You would get mini cars with working wheels, tiny board games in tins, little figures made from solid wood or metal parts that actually moved. These weren't just novelties, they were playtime essentials. They made it into your toy box and stayed there long after the fries were gone. And McDonald's Playlands? Forget the foam and safety nets of today. Back then, it was steel slides that burned your legs in summer, merry-go-rounds that flung you into the mulch, and hamburger jail cells you somehow got stuck in with 3 other kids. It was dangerous. It was chaotic. It was awesome. And no one wore helmets or seatbelts. You went home with scraped knees, dirty hands, and a big grin. The toys you brought back were battle-tested. They had stories, and you loved every dented, chipped piece of them. But when you weren't out climbing metal arches or chasing Happy Meal toys, you were at home, mapping out your entire week based on one very important little booklet. The TV Guide was sacred, not just a magazine. It was your weekly roadmap to entertainment. When it landed in the mailbox or showed up near the checkout line, everything stopped. You opened it up, flipped to your city's listings and went straight for prime time. You highlighted shows, you underlined movies, you circled the ones you couldn't miss and then argued with your siblings about what everyone was going to watch. There were no DVRs, no on-demand replays. You had to be in front of the set at the right moment, bowl of popcorn in hand, sometimes even timing your bathroom breaks to commercial slots. There were those glossy full-page ads for big specials, themed weeks, or Saturday night movies. And the crossword in the back? That was for grown-ups, unless you were a trivia whiz. Of course, all that planning was great until it got overridden by the ultimate authority in the living room. Because if Dad told you to change the channel, you became the remote. Before remotes were common or even invented, you were the remote. If your dad wanted to switch the channel, he would not reach for a device. He would call you. Go change it to channel 5. And you would march over to the television like it was your royal duty, grab the dial, and click, click, click your way to the right number. Those old sets had big knobs, heavy static, and that deep mechanical sound with every turn. Sometimes the picture would flicker, and you would have to adjust the antenna or give the side of the set a little whack. But no matter what, the kid was the one doing the legwork. You were part of the system, you were involved. And those channels you flipped through, they were chosen, not scrolled. You committed to what you watched. But speaking of flipping, our next memory is all about the grandest, weirdest, most oddly satisfying flipping of them all, with none other than Trapper Keepers and their signature Velcro sound. Home hair dryers in the 1960s looked like they came straight from a beauty salon, but without any of the safety checks. These early models had bulky hoods or handheld nozzles, often with thick cords that frayed faster than a worn shoelace. You'd plug them into the wall, perch near the bathroom sink, and hope for the best. No ground wires, no insulation. Just you, your wet hair, and a live current a sneeze away from disaster. The metal casing got hot. The motors sparked occasionally. And heaven help you if your fingers were damp. Water plus faulty wiring? That hairdo could turn into a fireworks show. Yet people trusted them because that sleek salon look felt worth the risk. Back then, it was just another day in the name of glamour. But if electricity was playing with fire, what we put directly on wounds wasn't much better, especially when it came in a bright red bottle with a mercury surprise. If you were a kid in the 1970s and you did not have a gas-powered minibike, were you even really living? These things were like pocket-sized motorcycles. No license required, no helmets expected, and no real supervision in sight. You would see kids as young as 10 zipping down sidewalks, through alleyways, and even across busy intersections, acting like they were in some kind of stunt show. The engines were loud, the brakes were questionable, and the safety gear was usually just a baseball cap. But nobody really cared. Parents would wave from the porch and tell them to be home by dinner. And the best part? These bikes were cheap enough that a few months of lawn mowing or paper routes could get you one. Police might stop and give a warning, but more often than not, they would just shrug and let you ride. It was pure chaos disguised as childhood freedom. Today, if you so much as start one of these in a neighborhood, someone is calling the authorities before you hit second gear. But back then, it was just how kids got around. Now imagine that same freedom, but with full-grown adults riding choppers that looked more like medieval jousting weapons than actual motorcycles. Made-for-television movies in the 1980s were not just filler. They were events. Whole nights were planned around them. When that promo would come on, this Sunday, only on ABC. You would perk up, lean in, and make mental notes to not miss it. This was before DVR, before pause buttons. You missed it? You missed it. These movies had titles like The Day After, V, The Final Battle, or The Ewok Adventure. Some were tearjerkers, some were thrillers, some were straight-up terrifying. And they had you glued to the screen, wondering how they managed to squeeze so much drama into 2 hours. Plus, commercials. Families would make popcorn, dim the lights, and treat it like it was an actual premiere. You watched it live together, and you talked about it the next day at school. Because chances were, everyone saw it too. They hit different. The music, The narration, even that grainy picture, it all added to the mood. You were not just watching, you were part of something. And right in the middle of those movies came the strange intermissions, ones that could go from innocent to haunting in 5 seconds flat. Electric slimming belts were the miracle fitness gadget of the 1980s, or so the ads claimed. Wrap it around your waist, plug it in, flip the switch, and prepare to get electrocuted into peak physical form. These belts sent pulsing electric shocks into your abdomen under the promise of stimulating muscles and burning fat. What they really did? Cause skin burns, fainting spells, and enough emergency room visits to make the Food and Drug Administration step in. They buzzed, jolted, and sometimes sparked, especially if you were sweaty, which the instruction manual encouraged. You'd lie there, twitching like a frog in biology class, convinced the pain meant it was working. These devices became so notorious that many were banned or pulled from shelves by the late 1980s. Today's fitness tech might still overpromise, but at least it doesn't literally jolt you awake. Unless you miss the 1980s, in which case, wait until you see what they handed to kids in the toy aisle next. A survival knife inspired by Rambo. Because what could go wrong? Spray-on snow was a holiday must-have in the 1960s, a seasonal delight that turned every window into a frosted wonderland. Just shake the can, press the nozzle, and watch as fluffy white patterns appeared across the glass. It was festive, easy to use, and absolutely everywhere. The catch? That soft, pretty snow was often laced with lead-based pigment. Yep, neurotoxins right in the living room. Kids would draw smiley faces and snowflakes, breathing in fumes and getting it on their fingers before heading back to sip cocoa. Parents sprayed entire windows from top to bottom, unaware that every jolly doodle came with a microscopic health warning. When the holidays were over, wiping it off meant smearing fine white dust all over the furniture, and sometimes even using dry cloths that kicked it up into the air again. It stuck to glass, to hands, and to memories. Photos from the era show smiling kids standing in front of the stuff, glowing with seasonal pride and unknowingly inhaling trace amounts of heavy metals. Eventually, safer versions appeared on the market, but for a while, decorating windows was more toxic than tinsel. And if the snow spray didn't get you, the bed you fell asleep on might, because some kids literally snoozed on pillows filled with flammable fluff. Get this. In the 1970s, there was no law stopping you from turning an old school bus into your family's home on wheels. You could snag a decommissioned bus for next to nothing, rip out the seats, toss in a mattress, a couple beanbags, and maybe a stovetop, and call it a camper. No certification, no inspections, no zoning permits, just pure imagination and the scent of diesel. Families would paint them wild colors, load them with mismatched furniture, and hit the road like modern pioneers. They did not have running water. Some barely had brakes. But they were mobile, cozy, and dirt cheap. There was something kind of magical about the idea. Taking your whole life, putting it on a bus, and driving until the road ran out. Today, you would need to pass a dozen inspections just to get halfway down the street. But in the 1970s, you did not need a license to be an adventure seeker on wheels. Now, if you thought turning a school bus into a camper was daring, wait until you hear about the three-wheeled wonders that are claimed to be safer than a sedan. Blank VHS tapes were not just empty plastic boxes. They were treasure chests, the kind you could label, relabel, and fill up with your own little corner of television history. You remember the sound, right? That whirring click as the VCR accepted your latest recording project, whether it was The Muppet Show, a Disney movie airing on Saturday night, or just some random commercials you ended up watching later like they were rare artifacts. Back then, taping something off television was serious business. You had to time it perfectly. Hit record at just the right moment, or risk catching the tail end of a news anchor saying, "And now," before your show started. Fast-forwarding past commercials felt like a power move. Rewinding? An art form. And if you had one of those little tape rewinder machines shaped like a car, you were basically living in luxury. You wrote on those little white stickers with a level of care that rivaled school projects. Do not tape over. Disney only. Toys R Us ad. Keep forever. And when someone in the house recorded over your stuff with a football game, that was war. But if you wanted to really test your patience and your brain power, there was only one screen-based challenge that ruled them all. Glow-in-the-dark stickers in the 1980s were the ultimate bedroom accessory. Stars, moons, alien decals, you'd slap them all over your ceiling and bask in the celestial glow every night. But here's the fun part. Some of them were literally radioactive. To get that long-lasting shine, certain manufacturers used phosphorescent paint that contained trace amounts of radium or tritium, materials that should have come with a Geiger counter, not a sheet of stickers. Sure, it looked magical at bedtime, but it was emitting low levels of radiation while you slept 2 feet below it. Parents had no clue. Kids loved it. And meanwhile, your space room was quietly setting off alarm bells in a future safety inspector's mind. As awareness of radiation risks grew, these glow-in-the-dark paints were pulled off the market or reformulated with safer alternatives. But the damage? Already done in bedrooms across the country. While that glow was subtle, the next invention didn't mess around. It promised to melt fat with the power of electricity. In the 1960s, cigarette ads didn't stop at magazines or adult TV shows. They showed up in cartoons and kids' programming, pitched by smiling doctors, dashing cowboys, and yes, even animated animals. Picture this. Your Saturday morning lineup is rolling, and between episodes of your favorite show, a cartoon camel struts across the screen, puffing away like it's the key to happiness. It wasn't subtle. These ads were bold, colorful, and carefully designed to stick in a kid's brain like bubblegum on a shoe. The message? Smoking was cool. Smoking was grown up. Smoking was what heroes did. The Marlboro Man became a cultural icon, and animated ads blurred the line between fiction and influence. Brands knew what they were doing. They targeted younger audiences with catchy jingles and slogans that wormed their way into schoolyard chatter. Even educational shows sometimes had ad slots sandwiched in that glamorized smoking without a hint of warning. And just when you thought that was the low point, someone thought it would be funny to actually sell a toy that involved broken glass in a bag. Yes, seriously. Three-wheeled tri-cars were one of the stranger automotive experiments to come out of the 1970s, and somehow they were totally legal to drive on regular roads. Companies like Dale and Myers tried to pitch these oddball vehicles as the future of safe, affordable transportation. But here's the twist. They were wildly unstable. They looked like space pods, handled like shopping carts, and tipped over if you so much as looked at a corner the wrong way. Some of them were so light, 2 people could lift one side off the ground. Still, they were street legal. There were no strict safety standards for this sort of thing, and as long as it had a license plate and functioning lights, it could hit the road. The idea was to offer fuel efficiency and savings during the oil crisis, but in practice, they were more likely to cause whiplash than save gas. That did not stop eager drivers from picking them up and zooming around town like extras from a science fiction movie. Today, these vehicles have either vanished completely or landed in museums as cautionary tales. But if that sounds bizarre, just wait until we tell you about kids riding gas-powered minibikes down neighborhood sidewalks like it was no big deal. Speak and Spell. A name so simple, you almost forget just how advanced it felt. This little orange learning machine had a robotic voice that felt both comforting and unsettling at the same time. The keys were rubbery. The screen was a small LED display, and the second it powered on, you felt like a kid genius. This was not just a toy, it was a computer. At least to us it was. And for a lot of people, it was the first time they ever heard a machine talk to them like a teacher would. It would ask you to spell elephant or photograph in that slow, mechanical voice. If you got it wrong, it would buzz like you had just activated some kind of self-destruct sequence. And if you nailed it, that same robotic voice gave you praise like it meant something, like it knew you. Speak and Spell was part game, part lesson, and 100% magic. You did not need Wi-Fi. You did not need batteries half the time. All you needed was the imagination to believe that this talking toy was the smartest machine in the house. And sometimes it probably was. Of course, intelligence was one thing, but style? That was another story. If you were the kid with this next item, everyone knew you had your life together. Plastic swords from the 1980s were marketed as toys, but they swung like weapons. These weren't the foam-filled pool noodles of today. They were thick, rigid, injection-molded plastic, often with jagged edges or molded blades sharp enough to cut paper and maybe a sibling. The worst ones came with faux metallic paint that chipped off into your hands and eyes during every pretend duel. You'd whack your friends with full-force backyard swings, and instead of a bonk, you got a thwack followed by a loud ow. Eyebrows were split, cheeks were welted. And if you really got carried away, a trip to urgent care. No one wore helmets, no one wore padding. These toys were sold in the same aisle as coloring books and stuffed animals. Eventually, toy safety groups stepped in, and by the 1990s, anything that resembled a plastic weapon had to be padded, foamed, or dulled down to baby-safe levels. You think that's wild? Wait until we get into the next bouncing nightmare that doubled as a choking hazard. Television antennas in the 1960s were a test of both engineering skill and sheer audacity. You'd climb up on the roof with a giant metal rod, twist it until the static cleared, and shout down to someone inside for feedback. A little to the left. No, now it's worse. Back the other way. It was like guiding a spaceship with zero safety precautions. Most of these antennas weren't grounded properly. That meant if lightning struck, and it did, it would travel straight through the antenna, down the roof, and into your home. More than one dad became an unexpected conductor trying to adjust the Sunday game signal mid-storm. Even without lightning, a fall from the roof was a very real danger. These weren't lightweight aluminum poles. They were heavy, sharp-edged contraptions bolted to chimneys or mounted precariously with hopes and prayers. Some families installed them with rope and ladders. Others just sent up the most agile family member. Signal boosts meant the difference between watching your favorite show and enduring snow-filled fuzz, so the risk seemed worth it. But what started as a harmless adjustment often turned into a near-death experience. And if you think the antenna was risky, just wait until you remember the glue that smelled so strong it knocked kids out before the models were even finished. In the 1970s, tourist towns across America fell in love with the exotic charm of tuk tuks and rickshaws, those little three-wheeled wonders that looked more at home in Bangkok than on a beachfront boulevard in Florida. But there they were, buzzing around like mosquito-sized taxis, legally driving alongside full-sized cars and trucks. Some were imported directly from Asia. Others were homemade contraptions cobbled together in backyard sheds using scooter engines and whatever metal scraps were lying around. They barely had suspension. Their top speed was a hopeful 25 miles per hour, and turning corners felt like rolling dice. But city officials thought they were charming, tourists loved them, and for a brief moment, they were as American as funnel cake. You could drive one of these with nothing more than a regular driver's license and a little bit of nerve. No airbags, no crumple zones, no real doors, and sometimes no roof either. They were part carnival ride, part cab, and somehow fully legal. Eventually, rising safety concerns and tighter import regulations shut them down on public streets, pushing them into novelty rides at festivals or private events. Still, for a while, you really could get picked up from your hotel in a tuk tuk. And if that sounds sketchy, imagine cruising through a rainstorm in a car that did not even come with windshield wipers. You had not lived until you beat the Oregon Trail without dying of dysentery. That was the holy grail of 1980s computer gaming. Those chunky gray computers in the school lab, that pixelated map, that relentless text box reminding you that little Timothy had broken a leg and your oxen just drowned crossing a river. Iconic. It was not just a game. It was survival. You learned real-life lessons in that pixel wilderness, like how much meat you could carry back from a hunt, not much, or why you should never try to ford a river without thinking it through. And somehow, we were totally into it. The green and black graphics, the clunky keyboard, the fact that it felt like schoolwork but kind of fun. You would all huddle around one screen, a group of 5 kids making group decisions like mini pioneers, and somehow it felt like the fate of your wagon family actually mattered. It was your first taste of choices in gaming, your first little moral dilemmas. Do you trade clothing for bullets? Do you rest for 2 days? Or do you push on and risk everyone freezing to death? Still, once the school bell rang, it was game over. And if you wanted to know what was playing in theaters that weekend, you did not Google it. You picked up the phone. Hypercolor shirts were the 80s fashion flex you didn't ask for. Touch them, and they changed color. Sweat? Changed color. Breathing too hard in class? Boom, color change. These shirts were made with thermochromic dyes that reacted to temperature, which was science speak for everyone can now see your armpit situation. They were magical for about 10 minutes and then quickly turned into an awkward middle school experiment. But the real danger was in the dye. Some hypercolor clothing was made with chemicals that caused skin irritation, allergic reactions, and, in worst-case scenarios, a rash that looked like a heat map of embarrassment. Combine that with fading colors, poor washing instructions, and mystery reactions when exposed to sunblock or deodorant, and you had a garment that fought back. Eventually, the clothing faded for good, literally and figuratively, and safety concerns helped bury the trend for a while. Still, for a few brief years, it was the coolest, most color-shifting thing you could wear until it gave you hives. If your shirt didn't leave a mark, the next toy definitely did, especially when it was supposed to be just plastic. Mercurochrome was the go-to cure-all for scraped knees, elbow bumps, and mystery cuts. Parents swore by it. Kids feared it. That bright reddish-orange liquid came in a glass bottle with a glass applicator wand, and just one dab left a dramatic stain that lasted for days. But here's the kicker. It contained mercury. Yes, mercury, the same heavy metal now known for its toxic effects. Back then, no one seemed too worried. You'd cry over the sting, get that radioactive-looking splotch on your skin, and be sent back outside with a pat on the head. It looked serious. It felt serious. It was practically a badge of honor. But despite the visual drama, the medical risk was invisible and long-lasting. Mercurochrome was banned in several countries over mercury concerns, yet the smell alone could transport you back to childhood panic and Band-Aid negotiations. But if your parents weren't coating your wounds with mercury, they might have been setting you up with something even more explosive, like a fun chemistry set packed with open flames and no supervision. Kit cars were the adult version of a Lego set, if Legos went 70 miles per hour and could possibly explode. You would order a fiberglass body from a catalog, bolt it onto a salvaged frame from a junkyard car, and presto, you had a custom ride. There were kits styled to look like sports cars, vintage racers, or even futuristic space cruisers. No two were ever quite the same, and that was the charm. What was missing? Crash testing, emissions control, reliable seatbelts, minor stuff. Laws eventually caught on and tightened up hard. Nowadays, building a kit car is like applying for a pilot's license with extra paperwork. But in the 1970s, it was a golden age for homegrown horsepower. Yet none of these Frankenstein rides held a candle to the tank-sized beast that was the used checker cab turned personal car. Owning a Trapper Keeper in the 1980s felt like owning a briefcase made just for kids, but with neon colors, Velcro, and personality. These were not just folders. These were statements. You did not just store your homework in a Trapper Keeper. You stored your identity. From bold geometric designs to wild illustrations of race cars, dolphins, or laser grids that looked like they belonged in a science fiction movie, the outside of your Trapper Keeper said something about you. And that satisfying rip of the Velcro? That was music. It had pockets for pencils, slots for notes, compartments you never used but felt cooler just knowing they were there. There was something so absurdly organized about them that it made you want to turn your life into a schedule. You would write the dates on your notebook dividers, color code your subjects, and then forget all of it by Wednesday. But hey, the effort was there. You felt important carrying one around. It made you feel like you were growing up, and even if you never opened it for anything other than doodling weird cartoons during math class, it still felt like a win. But when it came to keeping track of things, there was one object that really made you feel like a collector. And not just of stuff, but of memories. Breakdancing mats were the ultimate flex in the 1980s. Thin vinyl sheets with printed grids, graffiti fonts, or neon lightning bolts that promised to turn your living room into a downtown dance battle. But the reality? They were slip-and-slide death traps for anyone not named Turbo or Ozone. These mats were sold as practice zones for your windmills and headspins, but came with exactly zero grip. You'd try to bust a move and your feet would shoot out like you were skating on butter. Carpet? Too bumpy. Hardwood? Too fast. Concrete? Say goodbye to your kneecaps. Kids ended up with twisted ankles, bruised hips, and rug burns that rivaled carpet burn from summer sleepovers. Some mats would fold or ripple mid-spin, launching dancers sideways into furniture. And let's not forget the ones that came with sound effects, usually embedded electronics that broke by day 3 and left you with a $30 piece of plastic sadness. Eventually, people started using cardboard instead, because oddly enough, the trash worked better than the toy. Still, if you ever tried a headspin on one of those mats, you know exactly what it felt like to nearly break a hip before the age of 10. And while that mat just made you fall, the next invention brought literal firepower to playtime. Polystyrene cup noodle warmers were the product of instant gratification and zero caution. Before microwave noodles were common, people would boil water and pour it straight into a foam cup filled with dehydrated soup. But for the especially impatient or inventive, the next step was balancing that foam cup directly onto a gas burner to keep it hot. Polystyrene, in case you're wondering, is highly flammable, as in melts, warps, and ignites at low heat, kind of flammable. So what happened? The bottom would bubble, the sides would sag, and occasionally the whole thing would catch fire, turning dinner into a miniature inferno. The smell of scorched styrofoam was unforgettable and extremely unhealthy, but people kept doing it. Kids copied their parents, placing their cup of noodles just a little too close to the open flame and watching in awe as the foam darkened and shrank. Eventually, warnings were printed, packaging changed, and microwaves saved us from ourselves. But for one hot moment, dinner meant dodging a kitchen fire. And if that was not festive enough, holiday decorating added its own flair, with a snow spray that came with a cloud of toxic cheer. Back in the 1970s, monster trucks were not just something you saw at arena shows. They were rolling through neighborhoods like local legends. Drivers would lift their trucks sky high with no thought to rollover danger, center of gravity, or whether they could actually park the thing in their own driveway. Tires the size of bathtubs? Absolutely. No visible license plate? Who was looking? There were no limits to how high you could lift your suspension or how ridiculous your truck looked. If you needed a ladder to get in, you were doing it right. Police officers rarely pulled them over because, honestly, it was not even illegal yet. No one was worried about crash test ratings or pedestrian safety zones, and the idea of stability control was still hanging out in a notebook somewhere in Detroit. Today, height restrictions and suspension laws make sure your ride does not double as a climbing wall. But back then, the bigger the better, and the louder, the cooler. Speaking of things that would make today's DMV faint, let us talk about tractors. Yes, actual tractors, cruising down country roads without plates or papers. Back before virtual reality, Viewmaster reels were the closest thing to teleportation we had. A small red plastic viewer, chunky and indestructible, that you held up to your face like some kind of sci-fi binoculars. But inside, whole worlds waited. You'd flick the lever with your thumb and instantly jump from a still frame of Mount Rushmore to a three-dimensional jungle scene with elephants that felt like they could walk right out of the frame. Some reels were cartoons, others were travel photos, some were straight-up educational, which somehow made you like them even more. They were quiet, simple, and personal. You did not share your Viewmaster. That was yours. A private little universe. Every kid had their favorite reel. Maybe it was the one with dinosaurs. Maybe it was the space shuttle. Whatever it was your escape hatch from a math worksheet or a rainy Saturday. The 1980s weren't about flashy screens or downloads. They were about plastic, paper, light, and wonder. And somehow, that was enough. Actually, it was more than enough. But if you really wanted to feel like you were holding the future in your hands, you did not stop at a Viewmaster. You went for the gadget that talked back. If this brought back even one good memory, hit like and drop your favorite 1970s moment in the comments. And if you want more trips down memory lane, go ahead and subscribe. We've got plenty more where that came from.